Hey, it's Vanessa with CraftyGemini.com here to show you how to sew seam binding. If you're working with fabric that unravels a lot and you don't have a serger or you haven't stitched this part down, it can fray on you. So we use seam binding in order to conceal this. This would be an example of a seam binding. It's just fabric folded in different parts and different pieces so you have no raw edges exposed. And what you do is you tuck that seam into the fold of the seam binding, close it shut like this, and stitch it down. So it's concealing the raw edge, it's nice and neat on both sides, and you don't see any exposed edges. A few examples of seam binding can be purchased ones like the ones you see here. These you'll notice say single fold or double fold, it just depends on the width of the fabric, and then it'll also say on the bias. There's a difference between straight grain binding and on the bias. Here are two examples. This is a piece of fabric that I cut on the straight of grain. If I tug at it, you can see it doesn't really stretch. Here's one that I cut on the bias, and you see what happens. I get a lot more stretch in the fabric because it's cut at an angle. When you're using the seam binding, what you want to use the bias for, as you can see it has a lot more give, is for when you're attaching it to curves and things that are round, wrists, necklines, and things like that. The straight of grain is not going to give you that much give. It's more for straighter edges of your projects. Here's a quick tip on attaching your seam binding. Because it can be a little tricky depending on how narrow or wide your binding is, after I insert my seam like this that I want covered, I like to use a glue stick. I just dab it on the fabric to temporarily hold my seam binding in place. And then I'll take it over to my sewing machine and sew it in place.